Hello, Julie here and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I want to share 3 cards I made using acetate as the main feature of the card. I've used 2 different acetates, a thicker acetate for the card where the card base is made of acetate and a thinner acetate for the other 2. I'm going to start with the card that I have actually used the acetate as the base of the card. This is a thicker acetate. I'm not sure what brand it is or anything like that. I just bought it as a loose leaf thing many years ago from a shop that doesn't even exist anymore. Anyway, I've cut the acetate 10 inches by 5 inches. I've scored it at 5 inches and I'm going to fold it in halves to form my base. The pattern paper that I'll be using today on all of my cards is from this Prima 6-inch paper pad called Nature Garden. To start, I'm going to cut 2 strips that are 2 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to work with 2 of those to start with, and these are going to be embellishing the front of my card. So I ink around the edge of each piece with my black ink pad. I'm going to use double-sided tape to attach these strips about in the middle of the front of the card. So I'm going to stick one to the front and then I'm going to turn the card over and attach one as close as I possibly can to exactly on top of that strip, so that when you look at the card from the inside you don't see the back of the pattern paper, you see another piece of the pattern paper. I'm going to create my greeting for the inside of the card now, so I cut a piece of white cardstock that's 5 inches by 2 inches. I've got my stamping platform out and I've chosen a stamp that says "On Your Birthday." I'm going to stamp that with clear embossing ink, and then I'm going to use my superfine black embossing powder to emboss that greeting. I did use my little anti-static powder bag there, but sometimes a little bit of powder will get where you don't want it, so I use a fine brush to just brush any of that powder off that gets in the wrong spot. This is where I decided to bring in that 3rd strip of the pattern paper. So this white was 2 inches, so I've trimmed it down so that it's about 1 3/4 or a bit less, 1 3/8 probably. Then I trimmed that last piece of pattern paper down that was 2 inches wide. I trimmed that down to 5 so that it can fit nicely onto my card. I then ink around the edges of both of those pieces of cardstock. I used my double-sided tape to attach the greeting on top of the patterned cardstock, and then I attach that to my card base so that it sits directly behind the front decorative panel of the card. I positioned it there because I didn't want it to be visible from the front of the card when the card was closed. I need to have a place where I can write my personal message, so I'm going to cut another 2-inch strip of white cardstock, 2 inches by 5 inches that is, and I'm going to attach that to the outside back of the card base, directly over the top of the piece we've just attached that's got the greeting on the inside of the card. That way there will be space for you to write your personal message and it won't be visible from the front of the card. To decorate this card, I'm going to use my Heartfelt Creations Tattered Blossoms stamp and some Stays On Jet Black ink. I have stamped the images and then fussy cut them. So now I'm going to shape each one of those layers. I'm using my flower shaping tool, which is just like a tool with different size balls on the end, and I'm just pushing into the back of each petal to give it some shape. Once I have each of my layers shaped, I'm going to use my art glitter glue, just put a little dab in the middle of each layer. When I do this, I offset each petal so that they're not sitting directly on top of each other. Then I put it on my mat and use my tool to push down in the centre so that those petals lift up. To finish the flower off, I'm going to add a pink gem to the centre of each flower. Now I'm going to attach them to that front panel on my card. I don't want them to overhang too much because I don't want to be able to see the back of the flower from the inside of the card. So I use my art glitter glue to position them where I think they look the best. I was going to put a little greeting on the front. It says best wishes, and on the inside it says on your birthday. I used my Stays On ink and stamped that onto the front of the card. Once I'd stamped that on there, I didn't like the way it looked. It looked lost and insignificant. So I cut a piece of the pattern paper, the same pattern, and just to cover that up, a little strip, and attach that over the top of the greeting. Luckily, it blends in so well you can't even notice that it's there. So that finishes our first card, and because I've used that thicker acetate, this card stands up very nicely on its own. I love the look of this card in real life, but being clear, it's really hard to photograph. Okay, now for card number 2. To make this card, I decided to use some pearlized card. So I cut that so that it was 5.5 inches by 5 inches. I'm going to make a 5-inch square card. I score at 1/2 inch on the 5.5 inch edge of this cardstock so that will fold over and give me my 5-inch card. I also cut 3 1/2 inch by 5 inch strips. Next step is to cut a piece of acetate that is 5 inches square. Now this is the thinner acetate. I've got heaps and heaps of this, so I'm always looking for ways to use it up. So then I use my scoreboard to score my cardstock along the 5.5 inch edge, and I score it at 5 inches. I used this Kazaz embossing folder called Butterflies to emboss my acetate. I wanted to give it a bit of detail. I used a 1/4 inch double-sided tape to apply 2 runs of that along the 1/2 inch fold. I did have 1/2 inch double-sided tape, but I felt like it would be easier to get it right in the right spot and not running over the edges if I used the 1/4 inch, and it could slightly overlap because I didn't want any of the double-sided tape to show. Once I had that in position, I then used that tape to hold my acetate in place, being careful to line it up so that it's exactly along the top of the fold of the card. Now I'm going to attach one of those 1/2 inch strips on top of that so that the acetate is wedged between those 2 layers of the pearlized cardstock. I decided to try the 1/2 inch tape for this one, and while it went okay, it was certainly easier with the 2 1/4 inch strips. I didn't have to worry so much. I go back to my 1/4 inch tape and add one of the 1/2 inch strips of the pearlized card to the outside front of the card, and then the last of the 1/2 inch strips, I attach that directly behind that on the inside of the card. I hadn't pre-planned any of these cards, so it was about now I was starting to think, oh, what's next? I wanted to put something on the front of the card, but if you put something on the front, you have to also put it on the inside of the card so that you can't see the glue or the tape or whatever it is that you use to attach your papers. So I punched a strip of the pearl cardstock and trimmed that down to 3/4 of an inch. And then trimmed that down to 5 inches. I did that for 2 strips. I cut 2 strips of the pearl card that are 1 3/4 inches wide, I think, by 5, and I used my I used my art glitter glue to attach those punched edges to the long edges of that 1 1/4 inch strip. I used double-sided tape to attach that to approximately the centre of the card front. To hide the tape, I attached the plain piece of 1 1/4 inch cardstock that I'd cut. I flipped through my paper pad and chose a pattern paper, and I trimmed that a piece down to 1 1/4 inches by 5 inches. I used my black ink cube to ink around the edges of this paper. Before I attach that to the front of my card, I'm going to use this stamp, which I don't know the brand or where I got it from, and the greeting says happy birthday. I'm going to stamp that using my embossing ink and my stamping platform, and then I'm going to sprinkle it with my superfine black embossing powder and then heat it with my heat gun. Then I'll use my ink cube to ink around the edge of that as well. I'm sorry about the croakiness of my voice today. I seem to have a frog in my throat and I cannot get rid of it. Now I'm going to attach that embossed piece to the front of the card so that it sits evenly between those 2 punched pieces. I dug these porcelain flowers out of my stash. I've had them for years, since I was doing ceramics, and I'm going to use my hot glue gun to attach them to the front of the card. I'm not going to put anything on the inside of the card. If I leave that blank, then the person that wants to use it can write their greeting behind this front section that has this embellishment on it. You can write on this pearl paper with a normal pen, so I've just left that blank so that the personal greeting can be hidden behind the front decoration. So that completes the second card. It does stand up nicely of its own free will, so yes. Now on to number 3. So for this card I decided to heat emboss my acetate. So to start with, I cut a piece of cardstock that was 5 inches by 10 inches and then scored that at 5 inches to make a 5-inch square card. Okay, so I used my Spellbinders S6-025 square and Spellbinders S6026 squares, and also my Lifestyles nesting doily squares. So I cut the nesting doily squares out of cardstock and then cut the centre out of it using the smaller of the square dies, and then I used the larger of the square dies to cut the acetate. I could have not done that. I could have just cut the acetate with my trimmer, but I never thought of it at the time. Anyway, I cut 2 of the lace doilies, or what's it called, nested doily squares. I cut 2 of those, one for the outside and one for the inside, and I used the same die that I used to cut out the centre of the doily die cut to cut the front out of the card. To emboss my acetate, I'm going to use this Prima cling stamp called Daisy Trio. I'm going to use my stamping platform just in case I need to stamp it twice. I've got my acetate taped down so it won't move. I'm using my anti-static powder bag, and I'm going to now stamp using embossing ink, and then I will heat emboss that with the Wow superfine white embossing powder. Unfortunately, using acetate does cause a lot of a glare from the light that I have on while I'm filming, so that it doesn't look too dark, so I apologise for that. When you heat emboss with acetate, you have to keep your heat gun moving and don't let your acetate get too hot. Time now to start assembling everything. So I'm using my art glitter glue, and I'm just applying a very fine line of glue to the inside edge of my first scallop frame. I'm careful to make sure that I get all of the glue off that comes oozing out. Then I'm going to attach that so that the acetate is sandwiched between the filigree frame and the card base. When you do this, you need to make sure that you get any glue that might seep through to the inside of the card, and you also want to make sure that you line up your frame so that you haven't got any overhang anywhere. And then last step is to attach the frame to the filigree frame to the inside of the card, which hides any of the messy components there. I was undecided as to whether to leave this as an all white card, but decided that some lightly coloured paper behind the embossing would help the embossing to stand out. So I chose a paper from the pack, and I cut that down to 4 3/4 inches by 4 3/4 inches. I inked the edges of that and then used my glue to attach it to the inside back of the card. So you can see this through the front acetate panel. The greeting for the front of the card is one of my computer generated greetings. I just print out a whole sheet full of greetings in different sizes and different fonts. So I've cut that down, and I am going to attach it to a piece of the same pattern paper that's on the inside of the card, and then trim that down so that it's got a very fine border around it, probably about a 1/16 of an inch or less. I then used double-sided tape to attach that to the bottom right-hand section of the front of the card. To put a greeting on the inside of the card, I cut a piece of the pattern paper down to the same size as the one that I had just attached to the front of the card. I typed out a greeting and then printed it out in a couple of different sizes and formats so that I could choose one that best suited the size that I was going to use. I cut that out just using my scissors, and then inked around the edge of it and stuck it to the back of that pattern piece of paper that I used to that I cut the same size as the piece on the front. So there we have our 3 cards for today. I hope you've enjoyed watching my video, and if you're not already a subscriber, I would love it if you would subscribe to my channel and click that bell next to the subscribe button, and you'll be notified each time I upload a new video. Thank you for watching today, and I hope you'll join me next time I upload a video.